Hi, I'm Anya Samek. I'm an associate professor of economics and strategy at the Rady School of Management at UCSD. And today I'm talking to Pablo Pena, who's a professor at the University of Chicago. And he's just written a book called Human Capital for Humans. Do you want to show us the book?
Absolutely.
There it is. I like this book because when I'm at a party and I tell someone I'm an economist, they usually want to know something about the stock market. And especially in San Diego, they usually want to know something about real estate. Like, are prices going down? Are they going up? Can we afford a house now? What do we do? But really, I'm a behavioral economist. So I study how humans make decisions about everyday life. So, how do you choose whether to go to the gym or to sit on the couch? How do you choose how much time to spend with your kids and invest in your kids versus leisure time? And these are the types of questions that Pablo as well covers in his book. So, welcome to the podcast, Pablo.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
And I wanted to start by talking about Gary Becker. So, Gary Becker won the Nobel for his work on human capital theory, and Pablo was a student of his. He's since passed away, but leaves a legend at the University of Chicago. But I'd love to hear more about what it was like to be a student or how you met him.
Well, it was a great experience. I'm not gonna lie. The reason why I was excited to come to Chicago was him to a large extent. When I was in my first semester in college, he won the Nobel Prize, so I became familiar with his some of his work right as I was starting to learn economics, and I thought it made a ton of sense. And the first course that I took here at Chicago was with him. It was price theory. So I was super excited. To me, it was like going to Disneyland and meeting Mickey Mouse or your idol or whatever. I guess Mickey Mouse is probably not a good analogy, but uh, but beyond just like meeting him, meeting such a smart, creative person, the interactions with him were always productive. Gary Becker was a serious thinker, a serious intellectual that was incredibly generous with his time. So he would listen to anybody that wanted to be listened, and he would give people the benefit of the doubt. So he would listen to the wildest ideas and try to make something out of them. And I think the reason why he did that is because he was committed to the advancements of the advancement of social science or science in general. And he was not an enthusiast of publication and career advancement and well maybe this is going to get you tenure or this you can publish in a top 5 journal. He never mentioned that. He was also my thesis advisor. It was all about the question and the relevance, and he taught me a great lesson when I was a student. It was like a very interesting situation. I had an idea of how to measure people's willingness to pay for a better seat at a movie theater. This was before you could charge separately. This was like in the early 2000s. And there was no selection of seat at the movie houses. It was just general admission. And he funded a micro study so that I could record sitting patterns in the movie theater here on campus. So I had a little army of research assistants to record by hand where people were sitting, who was with who, at what exact time they arrived at the movie theater. And I had this hypothesis and I tested it with a little bit of a regression that I thought was a great pilot to then actually do something. And he funded that. And then after I was done, he asked me the question that he would always ask. What is the relevance of this? And I was like, but it's a cute paper that shows. And I was like, but what is the relevance? Now you're telling me that people value to be sitting at the middle of the theater and they're willing to trade that with space. So in other words, the ideal situation is you sit right in the middle and nobody is right next to you. But if there's going to be people right next to you, you may prefer a worse seat, but with a little bit of space to you. So I was able to estimate that trade-off. But pretty much he told me, so what? And so I stopped worrying about that question. It was a very big educational moment because I really thought, well, that's right. I can do something that is cute and smart and gets people attention, but it's not that relevant. Nobody cares because it's small potatoes. And I think after that, I always think when I'm thinking of an idea, what's the relevance of this? Is this really? And then again, going back to the other point, he never said you'll never publish this. He would never talk about those in those terms. He would say, how is this important? How is this help? How does this help us understand how society works?
That's really great. It's a good story. What is and the story I heard about him actually, I was at the University of Chicago for a few years as well as a postdoc, but I heard even when he was sick, he would leave his hospital room to show up to seminars to hear the research. So he was
He
really
was he
committed.
was he was really a role model in the sense that he would show up to his own seminar after reading thoroughly the paper that was going to be presented. And that's pretty unusual. It used to be the case here at Chicago that everybody would read in advance, and then the presenter would show up for a conversation, not for a presentation. And those conversations were really colorful and exciting. And as a student, I enjoyed them and I learned a ton. Unfortunately, nowadays people are very busy and they don't read in advance, so they kind of like expect the presenter to actually explain everything instead of having like already read that and jump into the commentaries or the criticisms and so on. But yeah, I think he was exemplary in every possible way as for as a teacher too, as a professor. He was really good explaining things, highlighting the relevance, not focusing on the technical aspects, but focusing on why these matter and trying to connect it to social sciences in a big picture way. So connecting it to the classics. He knew a lot about, you know, Marshall and Adam Smith, but also Plato or Socrates or whatever. So he would say this is, because some of the issues that he dealt with were very philosophical and why people have children, why they marry. Those are questions that many thinkers have chimed in, and so that was very important to him. Discussing family, discussing crime, discussing discrimination, and so on. So it was a very enriching experience to be in his classes. That's why I wanted to be his TA when he taught human capital, and I got to take his class, and then be his TA, and that's how I got like this passion for human capital. And I thought one day I'm going to write a book. So that day came last year.
And so we should talk about that. So he won the Nobel for having extended the domain of microeconomic analysis to a wide range of human behavior and interaction, including non-market behavior. And one of the key types of non-market behavior is human capital. So can you tell us more about what that means? What's human capital?
Yeah, absolutely. Human capital can be summarized as the collection of skills and knowledge that people possess. In other words, that are embedded in people that can be used or that help people produce things, goods, and services that are valuable to society. So, in other words, things that we care about. Um, and For a while, for decades, some economists, including Milton Friedman, Simon Kuznets, and others, had studied the returns on education and so on in the 30s, 40s, and so on. But it was really Gary Becker who tackled this question uh, systematically, but also extended the idea of this notion to other aspects of human life. To give an example, household production. So people may acquire skills through investment, perhaps formal schooling or on-the-job training, but many of the skills we acquire, are also valuable outside of the labor market in household production. So you become a better person running your own household. So he developed this theory where what we consume is not really what we buy at the store, but those are inputs that we use in a production process that takes place in the household. And so human capital is crucial there. And the returns in that segment, in that sector, don't show up in a pay stub because you don't get paid to do that. What you do is you get the joy of producing experiences at home. And the more human capital you have, the better your living standards, holding everything else constant. So that's, but once you start talking about household, you immediately jump into, well, having children and finding a spouse or a partner. And he described the marriage market. That was also a pioneering work trying to explain in economic terms how a marriage market would work, what were the implicit prices, and what was the equilibrium like. And it's very interesting because he had two models. One was kind of like I don't want to call it plain vanilla, but it was like the surplus producing view of marriage, where you know, spouses kind of like get together to produce some surplus, and then if they're efficient, they're together, and so on. That has implications like assortative matching. People who are more productive marry other productive individuals, and so on. But then later, I think probably like 10 or 20 years later, he developed an alternative view of the marriage market because that market, I think that view was not satisfying because love wasn't a feeling, love was a calculation. It's like, I'm attracted to someone because that someone is very productive. And that couldn't explain why people sometimes are in toxic relationships or fall for somebody who they don't even know. They don't know if the person is productive or not. They just love the person. So he developed this other alternative model. And with some assumptions about altruism and forward-looking behavior, he arrived at very similar conclusions about assortative matching and so on. So that was kind of like the Gary Becker style. He would produce one idea and then push it to see what were the insights, predictions, and so on. But if he was not happy, if he didn't conform with reality in one aspect or the other, he would keep thinking about it. And he developed that other model. And I think between the two, they do a really good job explaining some features of the marriage market.
So we got to back up and explain. Marriage market just means the market. Economists believe everything's a market, right? I don't think many of our listeners would know that term.
Yeah. So marriage market is the so when we think of economists really care about the marriage market, not only in and of itself, but also because it's a great allegory for many things we see in life. For instance, when we study labor markets, we see that um, a person is marrying a firm and they intend to be together for a while and they can divorce. When do you divorce? When you find a better partner out there. So it's the same idea that applies to a marriage market. So there's competition between partners and you're going to shop around and the other side is going to shop around, but it's a decision that is double-sided. Just to give you an example, when you go to the grocery store, the detergent or the you know yogurt cannot choose to come with you. You have to choose it. You select it, right? In the marriage market, it's a double-sided choice. You can say, hey, I really like you, but maybe that other person says, well, thank you, but I'm not interested. So there has to be coincidence of interest, and that makes it a very interesting class of problems. So the marriage market problem can be extended to, for instance, colleges and students, right? Students have preferences over colleges, colleges have preferences over students, and we have a matching problem that is a lot like the marriage market. So we call those uh, situations matching markets, but it always helps to think in terms of marriages because you're going to break up a marriage if one of the two partners can find another partner with whom he or she would be happier. So that imposes a constraint on how miserable that person can be in the current marriage. So, in other words, I know it sounds awful, and economists sometimes use very strong words, but bear with me, this is just an allegory. Um, I have to treat my wife well enough so that she stays with me. Because if I don't do that, then she might find somebody else that is willing to treat her better. So that imposes a constraint on my behavior, and the same happens on the other side. She has to treat me. And the more competition, the better I get to be treated, and vice versa. So that is, again, the marriage market in and of itself was something that Gary Becker studied, but then human capital comes in because it's part of what makes a candidate, a bachelor or a bachelorette, attractive in the marriage market. So when you say attain a graduate degree, when you go to business school, you're not only becoming a better prospect in the labor market, but also in the marriage market because people know you're going to be more productive. So either if they are kind of like the cynical version of love, where I want to be together with somebody who's very productive, or you just, I want to hang out with people I may fall in love with that are actually productive. So even if love is random, I want to hang out with the quote unquote right crowd, people who are going to have, a stable job, good income, and so on, that are going to be productive in the household and so on. So you can immediately see how human capital starts permeating different areas of life. Marriage and then having children and raising them is another one. So yeah,
So I think what's interesting here is that if you're listening and you haven't taken a lot of economics courses, this idea that we're going to create this math and it's kind of unfeeling, there's not a ton of emotions talking about how people match together based on productivity. It doesn't sound really relevant, but as far as, and I don't know this research very well, but maybe you do. We do see in the data, when we look at data on marriage and divorce, we do see that it follows some of these patterns, right?
absolutely. I mean, it pretty much any dimension that you can measure of people, their behavior, and their traits exhibits a correlation of zero point 0.6 across spouses. So spouses are more similar than random people taken from the population. So this brings to mind a very interesting study of that I actually cite in the book uh, of movie stars,
Mhm.
actors, and their spouses. And the interesting thing about actors is that the ones that are more successful are not necessarily the more educated. There's not a strong relationship between the A-listers and how many years of education they had. And when you look at who they marry, you see this same pattern of assortative matching. So, in other words, if you're an actor who happen to have a college degree, you're more likely to marry somebody, actor or not, who has a college degree. But if you're an actor who didn't go to college, you're more likely to marry somebody who didn't go to college. So you kind of isolate the income or the interaction situation, the aspects, and you leave kind of like the pure education, which is a very important aspect of human capital. So yeah, and this pattern holds, across countries and periods. If one spouse has more education, more likely you're more likely to find that the other spouse also has a high level of education.
So with the Hollywood, that's really interesting. You're saying the assortative matching works on the educational attainment, but not on the income level or like the success of being an
Correct.
artist or
And
being
and
a
and that's
doctor.
kind of like a little bit by design. But when you choose that sample, there's not a lot of A-listers. So, you can have a very
Hmm.
successful actor marrying another very successful actor, but there are not enough, I guess, for them to be a thick market. But certainly you see it in education. So in other words, think of George Clooney and who he marries, not necessarily somebody from the film industry and so on. Maybe it's a bad example. I don't know the educational background of George Clooney, but then you start going that way systematically, and then you find this pattern. So yeah, absolutely.
How does that, it used to be different back when women worked in the home and didn't get college degrees. So what was the matching like at that time? Do you talk about this?
Well, yeah. So I mean, you can go far back as the start of the 20th century, and there were some women getting college degrees. So not everybody, but at the same time, you didn't have a lot of men getting college degrees. So you had a small fractions, although the fraction of women getting college degrees was much smaller. So that situation gave the upper hand to women with college because they were relatively scarce. So that's when economic thinking comes to play, because we know that back then, just by sheer numbers, women with a college degree were scarce, desirable, and they would get a better deal in the marriage market. Now, fast forward through the 20th century, you get to 1980, and the number of people getting college degrees is pretty much the same among men and women, and you continue to this day. Nowadays, we have 40% more women than men getting college degrees in the US. That means men with a college degree are now scarcer than women with a college degree. So in this setup of the marriage market where there is a sortative matching in terms of education, now men with a college degree are getting a better deal because they're scarcer relative to the other side. So that's a very important conclusion. That means when we think of how households are configured, who does what in the household, the bargaining power is now relative to the past on college educated men. Now, that would be the prediction. It's not easy to see exactly what happens in the household. That sort of sheds light uh, on what are the dynamics that could be happening. And I'm sure some of your students are going to be interested in these patterns because it affects them. Nowadays, young people are going to have a very different market that their parents or their great parents, or I'm sorry, yeah, their grandparents or their great grandparents.
So especially with AI and all these different kind of alternative ways that people learn online. And I'm curious whether when you say college, we're thinking about college as an investment in human capital that transforms you into being more productive in society, or are we thinking about college as just a signal of your skills and intelligence, and college could be replaced with some other indicator down the road?
Um, I think that that's a great question, and I think that when I think of college, I do not think too much of it as a signal. It may have a little bit of value, but I don't think overall the fact that people are willing to spend 4 years in like working hard, reading and taking tests and so on, and means that the value as a signal, uh, if it were a signal, it would be tremendously wasteful in the following sense. You could be working somewhere else, showing that you're disciplined, that you can take on responsibilities, and you will get paid. So what we do in a college, I think, is we try to make our students be exposed to ideas, learn how to solve problems, and so on. It's not so much the knowledge itself of, geography or history or whatever, or even economics. Like there's a passage in the Principles of Economics. I think it's in the Principles of Economics of Alfred Marshall, which says, economics. I teach economics, so I'm gonna talk about economics. It's not a body of concrete truths. It's a toolkit. It's an engine of analysis. And what we show students is this idea of how to attack questions, problems, and so on. So um, maybe college has a bit of a signal value at the margin, but overall, I think if people are willing to spend that kind of money and time, it's because it pays. Otherwise, people could open up like ETS, College Board, and whatnot, could just give aptitude exams and say, look, this kid is bright. Go straight from high school to McKinsey or to JP Morgan. But we don't see that. JP Morgan recruits college graduates. They could recruit the kids that are already admitted to, the Ivy League schools, but they don't do that because they want maturity. They want people to know how to think about questions, how to communicate, and I think that is important. And just the nail on the coffin is uh, graduate school, medical school, law school. I mean, people learn stuff there. You wouldn't like to go to a surgery room, with a doctor that's actually just very smart and didn't go to medical school. So it's not the signaling. I think that the idea of signaling is true in other markets, but in education, it is really not. It doesn't hold much water.
I had a lawyer that was working for me for a while, and I got mad because he couldn't understand this thing I was trying to explain to him. And then he said, "What do you expect? I was a straight C student." I was like, "Why didn't we start with that?" But yeah, definitely. Yes. Now I check the GPAs of any professionals I hire. That's super interesting. So human capital, this idea that humans evolve we think about investment markets, matching markets with other humans in the context of marriage. I think there's a lot there as well that Gary Becker worked on investment in children. And one
Right,
of the things that I've worked on as well is early childhood interventions and how do we encourage parental investment. There's some really interesting questions about if you have two children and one is performing better than the other one, who do you invest more in? Like, who do you send to tutoring? Is it the one that's falling behind so you can equalize, or is it the one that's
right.
performing really well so you can kind of push them further? So these are a lot of really interesting kind of questions in households and human capital. I think what you had wanted to talk about from your book was chapter 10. And if I'm
Right.
seeing right, I think that's a super interesting chapter that's about why people develop lifelong passions and how we think about development of preferences. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, that's right. Just let me go back 1 second because you mentioned the equity efficiency trade-off. In the book, I use Bart and Lisa Simpson as an example of exactly what you were saying. What would Homer and Marge do if they could only send one of them to college?
Uh-huh.
And it becomes interesting to think broad picture whether the parents would have an option to write a contract by which, say, if Lisa went to college, she would help out Bart in adulthood. And the reason why I mention this is because you go from sort of like the intimacy of a family decision to, if you use the family as an allegory for society, then you have a human capital reason for a progressive tax system that is saying society is willing to subsidize higher education as long as those who get that bang for the buck, the society's buck, are gonna participate with more resources for society. So it's kind of like the market aspect of this trade-off. Um, Now going back to chapter 10 in the book, which is about taste, I think um, part of what Becker and co-authors argued is that sometimes economists shy away from discussing preferences. Somebody at some point said, it's taboo to talk about preferences, leave them alone, take them as exogenous fixed. And Gary Becker and George Stigler wrote a paper, I believe in the 80s. Um, Very interesting that I think more people should read. That is part of what I describe in chapter 10, which is this notion that uh, past consumption affects how much you enjoy current consumption of pretty much anything.
So
In
when
other
we
words,
talk, just to break it up, when we talk about preferences, we're saying like preference for classical music or preference for um, going and watching a boxing match. Is that kind of the type of
that's
preference?
correct, or for sushi, or for
Okay.
wine, or yeah, absolutely, traveling. So the things that we like, that we enjoy, how we feel about them, um, it's a function of what we've consumed in the past. And the way Becker and Stigler thought about that is just like when we learn basic economics and we say peanut butter and jelly are complements because one makes the other better and vice versa.
Hmm.
What we think is, well, the more I learn about wine appreciation in the past, in other words, that I've consumed more wine, that is going to let me appreciate wine more. Or the more sushi I've had, the more I know, the more I've acquired the taste for sushi or classical music and so on, reading,
So I gotta
novels and so on. So,
I gotta
um,
stop you about peanut butter and jelly to tell a personal story.
okay, please do.
Um, so I came to America when I was 8 years old and from the Soviet Union, which is no longer the Soviet Union, but back then it was. And we had never had peanut butter. Not only had we never had peanut butter, but we never had peanut butter and jelly. And we because we didn't have a lot of money and we received food aid and we received a lot of food aid in the form of peanut butter because America believes just give someone peanut butter and some white bread and they're going to be good, or at least at that time. So we had so much peanut butter. My parents, who were in their late 30s, they refused to eat the peanut butter. They had, no taste for peanut butter. I ate the peanut butter. Uh, it's new to me, but I was 8, so I formed a taste for peanut butter, but to this day, I will never eat a peanut butter jelly sandwich. I think they're weird. I would never put jelly on peanut butter.
Right,
So that I think that's a great example of this. It's like these
right,
are these tastes that develop, and my kids, I don't give them peanut butter jelly sandwiches because I'm not used to it, so they're not used to it either. I mean, they're exposed to it a bit at school, but that's also not something they eat. And I know Americans, this is like the staple. They eat this all the time.
right. No, absolutely. I think that you can find a ton of examples of this kind of habit, acquired taste, and so on. I'm from Mexico. My wife is American. She loves peanut butter jelly sandwiches. I'm not a fan. I could eat them, but it's emergency food, not like every day. Like there are many things. I would make a quesadilla, five different kinds of quesadillas before making a peanut butter jelly sandwich. But but my kids like spicy food because since they were little, I've been giving them, spicy condiments and whatever. So it is a reality that there's this control that we have directly or indirectly of our preferences, and they are pretty explainable. So there's no reason for economists to shy away from that. Uh, the example that you gave about peanut butter, um, there are interesting studies that show that this is cited in the book too, how the specific brand of a product you were exposed to in childhood shapes what you buy when you're old. Like for instance, if you're in a city where Tropicana is the brand of orange juice that is more popular than Minute Maid, in San Diego, let's say. You grow up in
Mhm.
San Diego and then you move to Boston. And in Boston is the opposite. Minute Maid is more popular than Tropicana. You turn out to be more likely to keep consuming Tropicana there. And the same goes for, cereal, mayo, ketchup, whatever, which is difficult to explain other than by this type of habit creation, complementarities. And when you start thinking seriously about uh, this type of complementarity, it has a lot of potential implications. Like, for instance, when we think of something very consequential, babies,
Mhm.
if we grow up around babies because we had siblings, nephews, nieces, um, then our preferences for having babies are going to be different than if we grow up without babies around us. So you have this kind of externality. In other words, what people do, they do it because they want it, but it has an effect on other people. So you have this reduction in fertility, which is something discussed in the book. But one, say, externality byproduct of that is people desiring less than ever to have children because they're exposed to babies less and less. So that's one, hypothesis to say there's this external effect, this externality whereby, well, I, my family is small relative to my parents'. My parents' families were big, mine's small. I didn't grow up around babies, so to me, I had a couple of kids much later. But if you're not around babies, it's not as important to you, appealing. And here's another twist, because this can get kind of serious too. I have lighter examples, but this is kind of like serious too. The structure of the family, the modern family, also means we don't see people passing until we're pretty old. In other words, the fact that people live longer and that we
Mhm.
have smaller families means that there's no the you don't see your grandparents die until you're an adult. And
Mhm.
then by the time your own parents and nieces, I'm sorry, uncles and aunts die, you're pretty much an older adult. Um, and in the past, people would experience death all around them, starting with, you know, child mortality was pretty high, but also people would die much earlier, and families were larger, which means you would have uncles that were old. Your grandparents uh, wouldn't live that long, and what that meant is you were exposed to death. And if you believe, I don't know if you have had deaths in your immediate circle, but when you have it, that shakes you, not only in terms of grief for the moment, but that might change your outlook on life. And that's something that it can be framed in terms of what I was discussing before. These experiences shaping your current consumption, and that's if you think about it that way, then this demographic transition had another byproduct, which is we kind of became less exposed to these life events, births and deaths. Now, from there, you can jump to, well, what would be the effects of those kinds of patterns? And you know how sometimes older people say, well, I see that youngsters today are very self-centered. It's all about me, 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 not my family, not my community, or not so much my family or my community. Well, you start getting some hypotheses from this theory of consumption being complement through time, coming from this reduction in the deaths and births that you experience in your immediate surrounding. And then you can, through this uh, uh, theory, potentially coming up with policy options, right? You could say, well, can some form of social service make youngsters interact with babies in nurseries? Like instead of like having military service like in some countries, you might say, hey, you know what? You have to spend a year in a daycare, helping out, hanging out with babies, and so on. I'm not saying it's optimal, but I think it's like if you think along these lines, and also in nursing homes for the elderly, like you have to be exposed to what it means to grow old and people passing, and if you believe that that can help people lead a more fulfilling life, then that could be an interesting policy option. But it comes from this way of thinking about number one, preferences being to some extent malleable and these
Mhm.
externalities. And suddenly, instead of thinking about preferences are taboo, you start digging a little bit and you get into these interesting places that potentially could be insightful. There's not really easy way to test these hypotheses, but I think it's worth posing them.
So in terms of being exposed to babies, it sounds like there's a clear kind of effect, then you have more babies. I wonder if you see that. Do you see this in data with older siblings versus younger siblings and one having more babies than the other?
Uh, well, the problem you do, I mean, I've seen it, but the problem is that is confounded by the overall trend down in fertility. So you could always, it's like a cohort
Mm,
effect, meaning
okay.
younger cohorts always have fewer children. So it's difficult to isolate that fact, but but I'm sure somebody smarter and more creative than me can tackle these kinds of questions. I love the idea of posing the questions and then letting somebody with more resources and patience to try to estimate this.
So
Uh,
I
so
I have some kids, and my younger sister grew up with no babies around, and everyone in my family has been asking her she's gonna have babies, and she's resistant. She just got another cat. But you're telling me I should expose her to some babies.
uh,
Or
definitely,
is it
I
too
think
late? She's in her 30s. Is it too late? Is it too late? Are
I
preferences
don't think it's too
more
late.
valuable
No.
early?
No, look, I I really didn't interact much with babies until I became a father.
Okay.
And once I became a father, I love interacting with babies.
Okay.
And so I think that it is true that if you kind of like take that step, I think siblings are great for that purpose because you can interact with their babies, but it has to be, I believe it has to be kind of a little bit intense and nice and so on. I cannot recommend how to do it because I didn't do it with my sister and my brother when they had babies. I was like, yeah, it's fun to hang out with them, but not so much. But I do believe that um, there is there is potential policy implications or actionable insights coming from this theory. I think there's some value to it. Uh,
So we've talked about babies. What about being exposed to older people or being exposed to death? Do we have
yeah.
hypotheses for
So,
what?
so, so the way I think about that is that so I don't have I don't have evidence, but I've never heard of anybody contradicting this notion. Nobody in their deathbed ever said, "Oh my God, I wish I had spent more time at the office." They always say, I should have spent more time with my kids or with my wife or with my this. They never said, man, I should have written this additional paper that I never wrote. I think it
I don't
illustrates
know, Gary Becker maybe.
maybe, who knows? But I think that death is I don't I, preference shifter. It's not that it actually shifts preferences, but it moves you to a different place of your tastes, and it reminds you of what is important. And I think if people are exposed to that, they're gonna hopefully live their life in a better way according to their own judgment. So that's my intuition based on personal experience. I haven't found anybody that said no. After some event, tragic event like that happened, I realized that whatever, I continue living my life the same way, and I am the most important person in the universe. Typically, is you know what, I have to not fight with those around me. I have to appreciate that I have time, count my blessings, and so on. And a lot of people argue that that attitude is actually good for you. It actually results in greater well-being and so on. So again, this is a hypothesis. I don't have evidence. I think collecting this kind of evidence is complicated. But again, I leave it to somebody smarter and more tenacious than me to try to test this. Uh, but I think it is, again, something that statistically, in the book, I show some calculations, some numerical simulations of how many deaths around you you're going to experience according to your age and how many deaths your grandparents or great grandparents experience. And you see a fantastic drop. So now we become what I would call life illiterate. We don't see people giving birth around us, and we don't see a lot of people dying around us. And 100 years ago, people were attuned to that. They knew that this was a celebration to have a baby, and it was like a new human being around. It was so cool. And people pass, so you have to make the most out of your days here and while you're alive and so on. And now we don't see that. So we, I think, have become more frivolous, self-centered, and so on. It's a hypothesis, but I think it's kind of like a reasonable one.
So I've always thought about preferences being expressed as a gene environment interaction. So there's something kind of innate about what you might prefer and something that's very much shaped by environment, like your parents, your peers, your neighborhood, your city. Is that kind of how you think about it in your book as well?
Absolutely, I think so. I think um, there's abilities and preferences. And I think both have a genetic component, so to speak, and both have an investment component. And that investment may be deliberate or maybe haphazard. So, in other words, like if you're born in Mexico, you're probably gonna be more prone to like tequila because that's what people drink there. You're gonna be exposed to that. It's not that, but also you can decide to acquire a taste. Like for instance, you say, you know what? I'm kind of curious about learning about football. I want to be able to understand this, and people get into something, or they get into board games, or they get into whatever, Russian literature, and so on. But um, I think there's the genetic aspect, and just like we can analyze that component when we think of, say, wealth or earnings, we can do it with preferences. So in the book, I reference a study of biological children and adoptees to compare the rates of intergenerational transmission, how similar parents and children are in terms of wealth, comparing adoptees and biological children. And the same in principle could be done when it comes to preferences. Like if we had indicators of behaviors, let me use one of the perhaps obvious, like alcohol consumption or cigarette consumption, or whether you like spicy food and so on. Those same tools that have been applied to earnings could be applied to consumption patterns and determine to what extent is the environment or is it something related to genetics, more biologically based. But absolutely, I think it's you can think that you can think the same way.
So I know your book is partly about giving people the tools from economics to make everyday decisions. So has this changed Has this economic thinking changed the way you make decisions? And for example, I'm thinking about you said you're from Mexico, you live in Chicago. Do you try to impart kind of preferences for being in Mexico to your kids? You take them there a lot, or what? Do you think
Well,
about that
yeah,
consciously?
to some extent, I know that if I don't inculcate some, let me call it consumption patterns, we could call them culture, because this kind of consumption capital can be understood as culture. If I don't do that, they're gonna lose it. Now, at the same time, let me give you another example. Um, I make a deliberate investment to watch sports with my sons because that way they're gonna like it and they're gonna like watching sports with me when they grow up.
Okay, but
So,
is that football? Is this American football or
oh,
like, is
it's
this soccer?
anything.
What are you
Football,
watching?
soccer, baseball,
Okay.
basketball, anything. I'm going all out in this case.
Okay.
But I think but I think you know it is important that once you understand that you can actually shape preferences. I mean, people to some extent know it, so I don't pretend to be the one telling people, hey, you can shape preferences. But I think once you take it seriously, you understand that to some extent you can do those kinds of things. There's another chapter that I haven't discussed here, but there's also parents inculcating guilt in their children. That's a concept that Gary Becker developed, very interesting. And the idea is how you make older adult children help their older parents. And the idea is, well, you can rely on, ethical systems, religions that always say, honor thy father and thy mother. That's, by the way, very common. Every ethical system has something like that, or every religion. And Gary Baker had the insight of saying, well, how does that play out in the context of human capital investment? Well, in a world where there are borrowing constraints, in other words, youngsters cannot go to the bank and borrow money to invest in themselves because human capital is not a good collateral. The family plays a huge role financing human capital investment. Now, parents have this dilemma. They can invest in the child or they can save for their own retirement. So there, we have these two competing needs and an agreement through which the child can commit to pay back to the parents some of their investment is a win-win, is a Pareto improvement in the sense that the parents are willing to invest because they know they're going to collect part of the return as long as the child is not just going to disappear and forget about the parents. So, in the absence of perfect capital markets, suddenly institutions that tell kids you have to be a good person and a good person takes care of their parents when they're in need, when they're old, and so on, then you have this economic force behind in favor of efficiency behind these types of institutions that you see in many places, which is, hey, take care of your parents when they're old. Now, compare that to any other species on the face of Earth. They don't invest in the old. Why put resources in the elder when all those resources could go to the young beings, the children or the um, and I think the reason why it's efficient is because this human capital asymmetry, like parents have the resources to invest and can collect a return. And in a way, that could help explain, it's not the only force, but it could help explain why in poor countries you see more multi-generational households because they're supporting like the current adults are supporting older people because they supported it earlier. And in rich countries, you don't see that much because if you're rich, you don't need to commit, you don't need to force your kids to commit to help you. And so I call this benign guilt because parents kind of inculcate this benign guilt. It's guilt, but it's benign because it acts in favor of the child. Because if you didn't feel guilty, your parents wouldn't invest as much in you. So that's again kind of like this interesting preference formation type of mechanism through some form of inculcating guilt that turns out to affect markets.
So before you said guilt, I was about to ask you whether parents kind of inculcating their kids with their own preferences is selfish. So is it, am I selfishly putting my kids, in ballet class so that I can go watch the ballet performance and have this in common with them when they're older and go to ballet, go to the ballet. This is what I do. But is this fully selfish, or do we believe that we know what's best for our kids' preferences and
That
so we do it for that reason? Like, what do we know the motive?
that is a great question. I don't think we know, and I think there's no good way to know. Number one, what's best and to what extent it is done. Most parents, um, you're a parent, so most parents know that um, it's difficult to make decisions, and sometimes you have to make decisions with not a lot of information. So uh, you don't have all the possible activities. You don't know all the possible activities that your kids could engage in. So you're going to choose based on what you know, which already involves your partly your preferences and the information you have and so on. So it's inevitable, and that's most obvious when you marry somebody with a different upbringing. My wife American, I'm Mexican, so I said we should be uh, more strict,
Hmm.
and she says no, we should be softer or more lenient or more supportive, and I'm like no, we should push them harder. She's like, you know, and it is the same thing. Now, am I trying to inculcate my preferences, or it's just what I know? I'm saying, look, I it worked with me kind of.
Hmm.
And when it comes to parenting, we have a lot of evidence about one style, and probably and we would like to know more parenting styles, but it's impossible to know that for many aspects of life. So that's why we tend to rely on I believe that's why we tend to rely on what we know that is not too bad, at least. Um, but yeah, there's undeniably a selfish component that is consumption for us. Kids, to some extent, Gary Becker, what he said is kids are both investment and consumption goods. If you're poor, they're mostly investment. That's what happened, say, in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. You had children that were going to be farmhands. So it was a good return to create people that would be working with and for you. Uh, but nowadays, they're consumption goods. They're just, a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money. And parents nowadays don't expect much of a return. They're not expect to be like in a country like the US, they're not expecting to be benefited from the investment. They expect the kids to be independent and so on. So to that extent, they're just consumption goods. So you have them and you enjoy them while you have them and you read stories with them and you know that's good for them. So you feel good. But also you choose to do things that you like. So I think there's no harm in that most of the time.
That's great. So we've talked about a lot related to human capital and marriage markets and thinking about applying economics to human decision making. It's really, really interesting stuff. If we're going to close with something, I'd like to ask you, what's the most important message from your book, or the most what have people told you was the most surprising or relevant to them?
I think that probably the macroeconomic implications of human capital. I think that you go into all these aspects of personal life, marriage, fertility decisions, um, education. I didn't talk about health, but health is a huge component, division of labor within the household and in the market, and so on. So that sounds like what people would describe as micro. But then there's the big picture pattern, which is growth. And what I argue, based on the teachings and work of Gary Becker and others, is that when we talk about modern society, what we're talking about is a virtuous cycle of human capital accumulation. So modern society is the result of a human capital revolution. People talk about the Industrial Revolution or the Enlightenment, but those are just ways to describe what happened once human capital took off. And in the book, I mention concrete examples of how this process happened, how until, say, 1700 or 1800, life was the same forever and ever. I cite Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher, saying, look, before he described life as inalterable. He said, by the time you're 40, you've seen everything that is there to see because life doesn't change. And now we know that life changes, just the AI revolution, and before that, the internet revolution. And it's just like the last 200, 300 years have been crazy for humans. If you draw increases in changes in living standards, you're going to see how it was flat forever and ever. And just a few generations ago, they shut up. So human capital is behind that. So it passed the critical level after which it was going to be accumulated at an increasing rate. And when people look at that way, they're like, wow, I now can connect the most micro decisions, whether to go to school, whether who to marry with, who do so household production decisions and so on, with the history of humanity. And that I think it's totally as an economist, that's very satisfying because it kind of like brings together the things that you know about how people make decisions and how markets operate, and you're able to explain probably the most important pattern in human life, which is the takeoff of living standards 300 years ago.
The human capital revolution. It's really interesting. Thank you so much for talking today. I'm sure our listeners, my students, everyone's gonna really take a lot away from this. Thank you.
My pleasure.